Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And, today we're really diving into some pretty interesting how analogies to other identities shape these conversations we have
Yeah.
about transracial identity.
It's a good one. I mean, it's interesting how they're used to both support and challenge, the very idea of it.
Exactly. And it's like, when you first think about it, it seems so simple. Like, well, if you accept one, shouldn't you accept the other?
Right.
But then when you start to really dig into it, especially with something like race, which is
Mm.
so sensitive and so nuanced, it's not that simple.
Yeah, it gets complicated real quick. And we've got a lot of different stuff to look at too. Academic papers, YouTube videos, even just people talking online.
Yeah, a whole mix.
Is this a pretty wide view of the topic?
Okay, well, let's just jump right in then. One of the biggest ones we see right out of the gate is the comparison to transgender identity.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And this is used by people on both sides of the debate.
Absolutely. I mean, some people say, look, if we accept transgender identities, then we should accept transracial identities too, right?
Right.
It's all about how a person feels inside, right? Like their internal sense of self might not match what they were assigned at birth.
Yeah, and we see this like really clearly in that video. In defense of transracialism, RCTA, they're all about self-identification and personal experience as the basis for both.
Right, right. But then you have other sources that kind of push back on that direct comparison,
Yeah.
like that YouTube video by Simon Cushing.
Oh, yeah.
He says racial oppression is different because it's intergenerational, right? Like there's this shared history of injustice that you don't really get with the transgender experience.
It's a good point, and he uses a very specific example. The Canadian Indian residential schools and the reparations that were paid to survivors, like it really highlights how that historical trauma becomes a part of a group's identity.
Exactly. And that leads to the question, can someone who hasn't lived through that oppression really claim to be part of that group?
Right.
It's a tough one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And this is where the analogy to transabled individuals comes in.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
And just so everybody's on the same page,
Yeah.
transabled refers to people who identify as disabled even though they don't have a physical impairment.
Right.
And so Cushing's argument is that, like, just like transabled individuals don't face the same oppression and disadvantages as people with actual disabilities,
Right.
someone identifying as transracial might not have faced that same historical racism as someone born into that race.
Yeah. He's basically saying if you haven't experienced that oppression within a certain group, your claim to be a part of that group is kind of weakened.
Okay, so it's like a lack of shared experience kind of thing.
Yeah. But, we have to be careful with this analogy because a lot of people criticize it. They say it downplays the impact of racial oppression.
Right, of course.
It's a sensitive comparison for sure.
Absolutely. And then we have the whole other shorekin identity, which adds like another layer to this whole thing.
Right.
For anyone who might not know, other shorekin are individuals who identify as non-human entities.
Like mythical creatures, animals, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And this one doesn't come up as much in these transracial debates. And even Cushing says he's not really sure how it fits in.
Yeah, it's kind of out there.
But isn't that interesting in itself? Like, could the lack of, societal recognition or oppression that other can face,
Right.
could that be used to argue for or against transracialism?
It's a good question. I mean, on one hand, you could say just because a group isn't recognized or oppressed doesn't mean that identity is invalid.
Right.
But on the other hand, you could say, well, that lack of shared oppression makes it totally different from race.
So it's almost like a double-edged sword.
Right. You can use it either way.
It shows you how these analogies can be helpful, but they can also be misleading.
Definitely. And we can't oversimplify things.
Right. We need to see the nuances of each group and not make these big generalizations.
Yeah, these analogies are meant to make you think they're not really answers in themselves.
They're thought starters.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like we're trying to put together this huge puzzle, right?
Yeah.
But some of the pieces just don't fit.
Right.
And we don't even really know what the picture's supposed to look like yet.
Exactly. And as we kind of go deeper into these comparisons, you start to see how this debate about transracial identity, it goes way beyond just personal feelings.
Yeah.
It really gets into some big questions about the nature of race and culture and even identity itself.
For sure. Like, how does this whole idea of race as a social construct fit into all of this?
Right.
We see that discussed in the Wikipedia entry on ethnicity.
Yeah. And that's a key point because the fact that racial categories have changed so much over time,
Yeah.
some people use that to support the idea of transracial identity like that. In defense of transracialism, our CTA video.
Yeah, they touch on that.
They're like, well, if race is fluid and made up by society, then maybe it's not so set in stone after all.
Right. But then you have the opposite argument, too. Like, even if race is a social construct,
Right.
does that mean anyone can just decide to change their race?
Especially when you think about all the oppression and power dynamics involved.
Exactly. It gets really complicated.
It does. It brings up this whole question of cultural appropriation, you
Right.
know? Can someone from a dominant group really understand what it's like to be part of a marginalized group?
And that leads us to another big thing, the ethical side of trying to physically change your appearance to match a different race.
Right. That's where the term RCTA comes in, racial cultural transference adoption.
Oh, RCPA.
Yeah, and we see examples of this in that study, Trends, Racial Identity, and the Effect on the Life Circumstances.
Yeah.
They talk about things like hair dye and makeup tanning, even surgery to change facial features.
It's wild when you see the lengths that some people go to.
Yeah, it makes you think about where's the line between expressing yourself and appropriating another culture.
Right. And critics of RCTA say that it often makes light of the struggles that people of color face,
For sure.
especially those who've experienced discrimination because of how they look.
Yeah, they see it as almost like playing dress up,
Yeah.
ignoring the real inequalities that come with race.
So can you separate someone's physical appearance from their race?
Right.
And if you change how you look to match another race,
Mm.
are you really embodying that identity or are you just playing into stereotypes?
It's tough to say. It all comes back to the need for open and honest conversations about this stuff.
Yeah, we need to be sensitive to everyone's concerns and avoid easy answers.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that behind all these debates, there are real people with real experiences.
Right.
We see this in online communities like those subreddits, Black to White Transracials, and the diracial community of Reddit.
These online spaces are really interesting because they give you a window into the lives of people who feel like they don't belong to the race they were assigned at birth.
Yeah, it's a place to share their stories, find support, connect with people who get it.
There's this one story in the diracial community of Reddit that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah.
It's about someone who was bullied for their appearance and they found acceptance by adopting a Japanese aesthetic
It's powerful stuff. It shows how much people just want to belong.
to feel comfortable in their own skin.
Exactly. And it raises some good questions about how we define identity.
Right, like what happens when someone doesn't fit into the boxes that society gives us?
Where do they go?
And with social media, it seems like people are finding those spaces online.
Yeah, creating their own communities, even if they challenge the norm.
It just shows that identity is complex.
It
It's
is.
not always black and white.
Way more than a label.
And it feels like we're moving towards this more fluid idea of identity in general,
Hmm.
you know? And speaking of fluidity, we can't ignore how science and genetics play into all of this. Like those videos, genome editing, Wikipedia, and what is race, biology, and social construction,
Yeah.
they bring up some really crazy ideas.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, this stuff about genome editing is wild. Like, imagine a future where we can actually change our genes, including the things that are associated with race.
Right.
It makes you think about, like, what even makes us who we are.
Yeah, is our race really set in stone, or
That's
is
set
it
in
something that could change?
And that video, What is Race? They talk about the K=5 partition, which is basically this idea that there are these distinct genetic clusters
Okay.
that could be used to define race.
So like scientifically distinct races.
Right. But even if science could prove that, would it actually solve all the issues around transracial identity?
Right. Would it make it more or less acceptable or just...
It's hard to say. I mean, it still wouldn't answer those questions about cultural belonging and lived experience and the history of oppression.
Yeah. And we have to remember that scientists are still debating about race as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. Like that Wikipedia entry on race, human categorization,
Yeah.
it talks about how much those definitions have changed over time and how political it all is.
So maybe science alone can't really give us the answers here when it comes to something like race.
Probably not.
Huh?
It seems like we need to look at the whole picture,
Yeah, the personal, the social,
Like,
the historical.
everything.
And all this stuff isn't just theoretical, right?
No way.
It affects real people's lives.
Absolutely. Like, people are making choices about their identity based on these ideas
How they see themselves, how they present themselves to the world.
and how they interact with others.
And we can't forget that there are so many different opinions out there.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
People who totally support transracial identity
Yeah.
and people who are completely against it.
We see that in those videos, the YouTuber who doesn't get racism and in defense of transracialism, RCTA.
It's a whole spectrum.
Right. And a lot of those critiques are about, cultural sensitivity.
Yeah. Being respectful,
The history of racism, the potential for harm.
especially to marginalized groups.
Exactly. They're worried about power dynamics and privilege and appropriating cultures that have been oppressed.
It reminds you that your choices about your identity, they don't just affect you.
They affect everyone.
You have to think about the impact you have on others.
Yeah, it's all connected.
So what have we learned today? It seems like this whole conversation about transracial identity is really complex.
It is.
There's no easy answers.
And the analogies we use to talk about it, they can be helpful, but they can also be misleading.
Definitely, we have to be careful about oversimplifying things.
For sure. Each identity category has its own nuances, and we have to be respectful of that.
And most importantly, we need to listen to each other
Absolutely, even when we disagree.
with empathy and
And
understanding.
a willingness to learn.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with something to think about. Imagine a future where technology lets us change our appearance to match any race we want.
Mm-hmm.
How would that change things? Would it make transracial identity more acceptable, less acceptable, or would it just lead to a whole bunch of new questions?
It's a good one to ponder. It really shows you how this conversation is constantly evolving.
Yeah, and that's what I love about these deep dives. It's not about finding all the answers.
Right.
It's about getting curious, thinking critically, and opening our minds to new ideas.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of transracial identity and all the different ways we try to make sense of it.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you learned something new, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.